Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga ki a mā kina ki uta ki a mā taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana te atākura he tio, he huka, he hauhu ti hei mauri ora. Nō re te ti e te tā e tātou mā kua whakaaro i ka mai e hono mai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Me ngā tini aitu a kei runga ki tēnā koutou, haere ngā mate, haere atura, moe mai rā, oki ai. Apati hono tātou, hono rātou tunga mate ki a rātou, apati hono tātou, hono tātou te honga ora ki a tātou. Nō reira kei ngā maunga, kei ngā awa, kei ngā moana, kei wānganui a koutou, ngā kai whakarongo, ngā kai mā take tiro anō, ki tēnei noho tahi, wānanga tahi o tātou, tēnā koutou, nau mai, haere mai, tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, all of our whānau who have come and gathered to this event this afternoon. E mihi ana. I want to acknowledge everyone that's made their time to come and share this next hour with us. I'd like to invite you to bring with you all of who you are, your mountains, your oceans, your rivers, all of who you are, what you value into this space. I'd also like to invite you to bring all of your questions into the space as well, because this is while it is a panel, it is a Q&A panel. Ko wai au, taku pāpā no Ngāpuhi, taku māma no Waikato, ko Valen Smith tōku ingoa. My name is Valen Smith. I am sitting virtually in my wharenui here at AUT University, which is Te Pūrangi, and I am your chair for the next hour. It is indeed a treat and an honour to be able to be chairing this wonderful whānau that we have in front of us here today. Before I introduce our whānau, there are some housekeeping things that we just want to let everyone know about first and foremost. I just want to confirm with everyone that yes, you are in the right place. If you are after the panel on the perspectives on power, change and the state for Chinese in Aotearoa, you are in the right place. Don't go to any other bat channel. Regarding our community code, I'm just going to quickly read through these. I'm sure you would have already seen this a few times if you've been to previous sessions, but be curious, open-minded and respectful. Be generous. We make generous assumptions. Confidentiality, one person, one mic, so one person at a time, please. Essentially, whānau, if we can keep this forum as respectful as possible, and just really underpinning those values, those Māori values of tika, pono and aroha, doing the right thing, having our integrity intact and doing what we do with compassion and being mindful of everyone. Ka pai? So now I'm going to introduce our panel whānau, because I don't want this to be about the chair. It's all about the panel and what the panel have got to offer us this morning. So on the panel, we are very privileged to have Kirsten Wong with us today. Ka pai, a little wave from Kirsten. Ka pai. We also have Mongzhu Fu. Ka pai. We also have Bev Chul Hong. Ka pai. And we also have Che Ming Mok. Ka pai. So that's our panel for today, whānau. Again, welcome. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Kirsten to start the first round of introductions for everyone. Kia koe, Kirsten.
I'm muting myself. Kia ora, Balance. And kia ora te whānau. Balance, thank you so much for your beautiful and generous introduction. Yeah, awesome. So, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, e te whānau. Ko Kirsten Wong, toko ingoa, no Haina, Batsiat Village, o ko Tipuna, kei te noho au, ki te whanganui a Tara. Daga ho, ngō gemang hei wo ngang fong. So I just said in Chinese that my name is Wong Ngang Fong, but in English it's Kirsten Wong. And my ancestors on both sides come from Batsiat Village, which is Whitestone Village in Jiangshan County, which is pretty close to Guangdong City in China. And my grandfather came from there to Te Whanganui Atara in 1895, and we've been here pretty much ever since. So before we start, I just wanted to say thanks so much to you guys for joining us. I know it's your precious lunchtime, so, you know, thank you so much. Yeah, it's great having you here. And look, giant thanks to Balance and Heather and Rachel and Grant, and I know there's heaps more of you, because I know you guys have been working for totally months and at great speed and detail. Oh, sorry, Stu as well. Apologies, Stu. And that organisation has really paid off. And you've been amazingly supportive. So thank you very much. And we really appreciate the time that you've given us in your program. So a bit of background. The four of us on this call are all sort of connected. So when we got together before the session to work out what we wanted to say, we decided that our different migration backgrounds were really important for understanding why we do what we do. So as you've gathered, I'm part of the early settler Chinese community. My family didn't actually come that early, about 50 years after the first Chinese settler who came in 1842. But I think, you know, we're still up to our fourth generation born here. So by the time I grew up in the 1960s, 70s, I grew up in a super English speaking household. I don't speak Cantonese, my heritage language, but I still grew up very, very Chinese. And I have a real big family. My grandmother had 18 children. So you can imagine the number of cousins I had, you know, uncountable really. So when I grew up, it was like kind of this big family ecosystem. We didn't even have to go outside the family very much for social interaction. So all the memories, all that history, everybody's stories and experiences from like the 1920s onwards, they were all right there all the time for me. But when I went outside the family, none of that really existed. So in the Pākehā world, all of that was invisible. And I think many of you who've grown up in the 70s and 80s and were not Pākehā will remember those times as being very, very white, very homogenous. And if you weren't Pākehā, you were expected to act like a Pākehā because, you know, that was just how you had to survive. But living that life for me was very difficult. And I've never forgotten that feeling of kind of looking in the mirror and not being able to see my reflection at all, just a sort of blur. So that was a big rant. But the good news is that the world got better through the 1990s. But that growing up experience really made me question, what is a New Zealander? How do I fit as tangata tiriti? And what can I do to contribute? And that kind of put me on the course to what I do now. So I spent most of my life working for government and policy and comms. But now I'm super lucky to do community and heritage projects. So big shout out to the New Zealand Chinese Association and the Chinese Poll Tax Heritage Trust for supporting that work. Might help to say the things I've worked on recently are the Ventnor Memorial, which was unveiled last year, and this commemorates the Chinese gold miners 499, whose remains were lost in shipwreck in 1902 off the Hokianga coast. And that memorial celebrates our lost ancestors, but also our gratitude to Te Roroa and Te Rarawa, Te Hua o Te Kaweriki Trust, who have all cared for our ancestral remains since that time, but also who help us now care for our shared histories. And that second project is to build an online space for Chinese New Zealand histories, which is a very exciting project, my total dream. And it will be accessible to everyone and especially good for the new history curriculum coming through next year. So thank you. I think I took up a bit more space than I meant to. But I think, Bev, I think you're up next.
Kia ora Kirsten and others. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Bev Cho Hong Toko Ingoa, no Nam Chuan, Bat Tong, Guangzhou, aho. Engari I whānau tōku papa I Te Whanganui Atara, I whānau aho I Hawara, no rira, tēnā koutou katoa. So, hello everyone, Daigo Ho. My name is Bev Cho Hong, and that's a mixture of my English given name, Beverly Ann Hong, and my Chinese ancestral name of Cho, so Ngāti Singh Cho, which is lost in translation in the migration process. So my Chinese name is Cho Man Fong. So Cho is my ancestral name, Man is my unique name, and Fong relates to the generation I am in the family lineage. So if I'd come here during that migration period, I may well have become Miss Fong. My whakapapa is with the Puniu clan or county. So in the same migration sort of time frame as Kirsten was talking about, my great-grandfather came to Aotearoa in 1896. He then went back to China actually and sent his son, my granddad, when he was 18 to come and settle long-term in Aotearoa, and my dad was born in Whanganui-a-Tara. My mum, she came to Aotearoa in 1939 as part of the refugee cohort of women and children when Japan invaded China, and remained. And although I was born in Hawera, my formative years were in Te Papaioia, Palmerston North, and that's where my mum's whānau extended family settled, and it was in the 70s to 80s, and it was the situation where, you know, at school or at events, the other Chinese, they were cousins, they were rallies, so it was very much like within that kind of framework. And the things that Kirsten has mentioned around navigating sort of the mainstream culture that you were surviving and outside of the home and the Chinese community kind of aspect, and then the insular Chinese community resonates with me strongly. I think a strong element of, actually, I talked to my mum about it, was trying to ensure that us children fit in to society and fit into the community. And so there was an element of fitting in terms of, I recall, you know, going along to in my cheongsam and doing the dances and everything as part of the cultural kind of aspect of the community. And at the other end of the spectrum as kids, my sister Joss and I doing the, what was it, children's sleepwear catwalk fashion parade at the main department store. So there was this whole range of things. And I think another thing was, you know, I hadn't actually really thought about it, but someone mentioned to me, how come all the photos of you as kids, most often you've actually got wavy hair? And I said, oh, because we got our hair permed all the time as kids. And I talked to Mum about it, and Mum said, oh, yeah, it was about fitting in. It was about you guys being able to not feel, you know, isolated as part of being in Palmerston North. I was just going to talk about some of the key elements, I guess, in terms of growing up, in terms of, you know, my mum and Gongampoa, that's my maternal grandparents' fruit shop, my auntie's market garden and helping out there, my dad's dental surgery and going and cleaning the surgery in the weekends. I think on the one hand, from that fitting in aspect, I have been told that I'm more Kiwi than a Kiwi. So I think I might have overachieved a little bit on that front. On the other hand, you know, as always, I've been told I'm too Chinese to fit into the society and I might as well go home, you know, go home sort of kind of stuff. So it's at times I think there was a very conscious decision on my part about how I was going to behave to survive and navigate, and at other times it was just totally overwhelming. But you make your way through, right? And I think one of the other key elements which has brought me to this place is having a son. So I'm a single mum with a teenage son, and he's half Chinese, half English, Irish. I sometimes forget the English bit, but he keeps reminding me. And I think it was really, really important to me that he have a sense of his identity as fourth also generation in Aotearoa, but also as a Chinese person. So we went to Yao Yun, which is the Chinese preschool. He learnt Shaolin Kung Fu. Part of that was so that I knew, you know, in the future, potentially defending himself, but having this sense of pride as to who he was. And I think the COVID situation kind of exacerbated that, in that he talked to me about the upped level of anti-racist behaviour on the social media at that time and his concerns about it, really. Sorry, that's my puppy. My focus on what I do currently. So I think over time I've got more and more, I think getting older, you get to a point of thinking, well, now's the time. If there are things I've thought about doing, now's the time to do it, because otherwise when am I going to do it? And I think the COVID aspect, has really brought to the fore kind of where things are at. So my focus is very much on strength-based as an approach and the need to promote and live the values that we espouse, because I think a lot of things happen as a reaction to a negative event occurring. A couple of years ago, I was part of a collaborative anti-racism initiative, art initiative, which tried to bring together Chinese communities, and there were, lots and lots of collaborators in that, and organisations including NZC, New Zealand Chinese Association, Asian Family Services, and the Asian Network Incorporated, and others across the Chinese community in the arts sector, and research and policy, and historians such as Kirsten. And I think that really made me realise the importance of actually showing up, and diverse Asian communities having a profile as being part of the conversations. And I think, so that's kind of where I am at. I'm very much focused on the and, which I think is a really important way of thinking about things in terms of plurality and power sharing within the Te Tiriti context. And that's and in terms of where we are and what has gone before, and in terms of ways of knowing, and that those ways of knowing being on an equal footing, and the and of whakawhanaungatanga, relationships and connections. I'm really clear, in my mind, those relationships, and when I reflect on my past and those connections that I've made, they've been the things which have really shaped what I'm doing now and where I might focus on the future. So kia ora.
Kia ora.
I'm now going to pass you to Tising Mok, I think.
Kia ora te whānau, kia ora OG aunties, that's old generation. Ko Kaurigang toko maunga, ko Zhujiang toko awa, ko Hainamana Marehia me Hingapoa toko iwi. No Puketā Papa o Tamaki Makaurau ahau, ko Ziming Mok toko ingoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou, katoa, dājia hao, huanyin guanling, and all the rest. I am Mo Ziming, or Ziming Mok. Ziming Mok is my English name. And I'm the Southeast Asian representation, I guess, on this panel. My parents are Chinese, Yunnanese and Cantonese, but from Malaysia and Singapore. And as a Southeast Asian Chinese, and there's like many different kinds of us, not just Malaysian and Singaporeans, but we're very different in terms of our diaspora histories compared with the straight out of Canton crew. There's this very, very thick extra layer of identity, culture, hundreds of years of diaspora, national history. So there's like actual national identities in the way in between. And very different migration experiences as well within the colonial structure. For example, my family, my parents came here in 1973 as part of the cohort of doctors that New Zealand poached from English-speaking Commonwealth Asian countries to fill a skills shortage that had been created by Britain poaching New Zealand doctors in the 50s and 60s. So it was like this colonial chain migration labor supply situation. And because of, I'm the child of doctors, I'm the child of immigrants, doctor immigrants. I think that my immigration cohort is actually the most privileged out of the entire Chinese diaspora here because of like a range of weird reasons that were a combination of luck and timing. One, we had class privilege, like my parents worked as doctors, like straight off the bat, not as doctors driving taxis, We had cultural privilege in terms of integration as migrants because we were pre-colonized, like there was no language barrier. There was actually very little cultural barrier in a way because we were kind of quite westernized in those countries by the pre-colonization process. We didn't even experience significant personal racism as new migrants in the 70s and early 80s because at that time, Chinese people weren't being targeted as like a threat. Other groups were being targeted very hard, but we just flew under the radar. So growing up in my early childhood with like fear of racism and racial exclusion, it just wasn't part of my experience. And that makes it like, it forms different kinds of people, It was after that first original wave of anti-Chinese racism and before the big anti-Asian backlash of the 90s. On the fourth point is quite interesting in that we were not only pre-colonized, but also pre-decolonized. Like when, we talk a lot about decolonizing stuff in these circles, your mind, the curriculum, but remember the baseline meaning of decolonization was decolonizing your country, like as in you do guerrilla war and like mass political movements to weaken the British colonial occupying regime and then like they leave. And like we did that, like Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, we like kicked out the British. And that was in my parents' generation, you know, that was their generation. This is why I sometimes say, oh, you know, third world boomers are the best boomers, because they kicked out the British and they came here, you know, with all these other privileges and good timing, but also with this cultural confidence that comes from being post-colonial Asians. Like, it's really a thing. Like, you know, like, hey, we kicked out the British and we speak 6 languages and we're doctors. What did you do? I'm like, dang, ma, okay, I get it. Asians, they're badass. And I grew up also in Mount Roskill in a very multi-ethnic environment. So like white school children never crushed my spirit, you know, which is something I know that happened to even my peers from my weird little micro generation of children of doctors, where they grew up in like Remuera or something. And you know, white kids were mean to them. White kids weren't mean to me, there weren't enough white kids. And taken all together, weirdly, it means that I didn't have internalized racism growing up, which is very rare and like weirdly, tragically rare for someone who grew up in New Zealand who's Asian. I just got really lucky. And all it means together is that I'm a massive Karen, like I'm really entitled because I'm so privileged. Like in the 90s, I first experienced overt, direct personal racism as part of like the Asian invasion backlash. And I was like, I am shocked and outraged at this treatment. I demand to speak to the manager of racism. Like, it never occurred to me to not speak out, to not get involved in social justice activism, because I felt that entitlement. And I just thought, you know, why wouldn't I speak out? Another symptom of having a very small community, which was very spread out all over the country in Auckland, we hardly ever saw each other. There was like we had like a circle of family that came at the same time, but there was no policing of you. No one was telling you to keep your head down. So because of that, I'm best known at Aotearoa probably as a political writer or commentator, occasionally an activist on racism, human rights, and like Asian issues, including in the active role that Asians and Chinese people should take as tangata tiriti in support of tino rangatiratanga, if we're to be real like anti-racists. And I've also worked a lot in the public sector and NGOs. I currently work for Auckland Council for a special Māori and Pacifica-led socioeconomic development unit, essentially trying to support concrete pathways to mana mutahaki. And that's where I am. That's my kind of context as your friendly neighborhood Chinese Karen, with like very unique experiences in this diverse diaspora. So I'd like to hand over now to Mengzu, who's the most recent wave out of us.
Tēnā koutou katoa, 大家好, 大家好, ko waiaho, 我是谁, no Guizhou toku whaia tupuna i te taha o toku matua, no Sichuan toku matua tupuna i te taha o toku matua, no Henan oku tupuna i te taha o toku whaia, I whānau o ki Tianjin, I noho o ki Tamaki Makaurau, engari ki te whanganui atara hau I aia nei. Ko Mengzu toku ingoa. So my ancestors were nurtured by the mountains of Guizhou, the rivers of Sichuan, and the fields of Henan. My parents and I were born in Tianjin in northern China, and I am the freshest of the plain out of everyone here. My parents and I moved to Tamaki Makaurau in the mid-1990s, as Ziming already referenced. That was kind of during the Asian invasion era of New Zealand xenophobia. So definitely around that time experienced some jarring public and systemic racism as a child. When I was a teenager in 2005, I got quite heavily involved in youth-based grassroots activism, firstly through the anti-war movement. And not long after that, my priorities really shifted towards supporting tino rangatiratanga. And some of the key instigators of that shift were the 2007 so-called anti-terror raids, where armed New Zealand police invaded Watoki. And to me, that was such a clear example of ongoing colonial state violence. It was also through reading zines like Mellow Yellow by Waiho. And that was kind of my first encounter with writing about being Asian on colonized land. I hadn't read your essay at that time to me. As well as reading this book called The Jade Taniwha by Māori Chinese author Jenny Lee Morgan. But I think it was in particular through meeting incredible people like Dr. Moana Jackson, that really cemented my understanding about what Te Tiriti meant and what our role as Chinese or Asians on this land are in relation to that. It was through Māori activists, flatmates, and friends that I learned the importance of knowing yourself first, being strong in your own culture to better relate to Māori. And that was kind of a key impetus that led me to work with my own community instead of white activists. So in 2016, along with 5 other mostly ethnic Chinese friends who are cis women, trans, and non-binary people, we had set up Asian Supporting Tino Rangatiratanga. And the name was actually based on a banner that some of us had made for Waitangi in 2010, and one we had stood behind that year. There was only like 4 of us at the time. And as a group, it's grown a lot over the years with much support and guidance from people like Dr. Moana Jackson, from Sina Brown Davis, Alicia Hume, Aaron Yuapu from Racial Equity Aotearoa, people like Dr. Arama Rata and Marama Davison, who we've had quite long-standing relationships with. And the original intent of the group was kind of twofold. One was to take collective responsibility as Asians for educating and engaging our own people on Te Tiriti through Te Tiriti workshops, partly because Pākehā organised treaty workshops are often centred on Pākehā experiences and often culturally unsafe for non-Pākehā tauiwi, and partly because we should not expect Māori to carry that burden of educational labour. And the second part was to kind of show up in solidarity for Māori-led movements and mobilise our own communities when we're kind of called to support, to be there on the ground, especially for land and border protection against ongoing colonisation. So as an organisation, it's grown from Tamaki to Pōneke, Otepoti, and very recently Ōtautahi. So if you're in any of those places, feel free to get in touch if you want to get involved. A lot of that work has kind of led to informing my current PhD research, which is on Chinese diasporic solidarity with Indigenous sovereignty movements in both Aotearoa and Canada-occupied Turtle Island, where I also have extended family. And I'm really interested in the kind of possibilities of mutual learning that can happen transnationally, because obviously, white supremacists have these transnational links as well, and we need to and we thought it's really important that we actually have some historical context to our discussion. So I'm going to pass it now to Kirsten to present some brief history on Chinese in Aotearoa.
Kia ora, Bingzu. Man, you're on fire. That's all I can say. It was so good. Yeah, so good. Anyway, I'm going to show you just a super quick wrap up about our history, and you'll see some nice pictures soon. Oh, why didn't I do the? Oh, can you see that? Anybody?
Just go back to the first slide, Kirsten.
The first line. Oh, here we go. Duh. Right. Okay, good. Okay, well, we just thought we'd do a quick run through of history. So let's see, hopefully this will give you a bit of context. So the first Chinese came in 1842 for a bunch of reasons, but one was the Opium War. In 1839, Britain invaded China because they wanted to sell their Indian opium to the Chinese, and at that time opium was illegal in China, so it was pretty much a forced trade war. That war ran from 1839 to 1860 and especially hit the home villages of the early Chinese migrants. So you can see on the left here, British troops outside Canton in 1841, and then on the right, the British attack on Otuihu Pa, which was, I think, the first burning, first attack after the burning of Kororaraka. So definitely colonial forces at work at around about the same time, but in different places. So those first big groups of migrants came in the 1860s from those very areas that were affected by the Opium Wars, from the Punyu area. And very quickly, there was a racist backlash, let's say. So many of you know the poll tax, which I won't read it again for you on the right, but you can see some information about that there. But also not only the poll tax, but also the withdrawal of the right to naturalisation from 1908 to 1951, and not being able to get social security benefits, whether you're a naturalised Chinese or not. So those immigration restrictions, they were only levied against Chinese. You can see from this graph here that it had a very, very strong impact on the numbers of Chinese. So I think the height was 5,000 at the height of the gold mining period, up to World War II. And then after World War II, you can see a very, very slow increase up to 1986. And that increase was basically natural increase and some very specialist migration exceptions. So that was the 1939 war refugee intake, some Colombo Plan students who had come here and then applied for residency, and then people like Seming's parents who came under the special schools categories, which used to be called, the occupational priority list, as it's called at one point. But also migration from the Pacific, particularly from Samoa and Fiji. And I wanted to quickly show you Zeming's beautiful graph, which expresses ethnic Chinese as a percentage of New Zealand population. And you can see that after the 1987 immigration reforms, which were which basically shifted from being a preference towards nationality and ethnically based migrants to a migration policy based on broad criteria. So after that, you can see a huge increase in Chinese migration. So with that big post-1987 increase, you get, again, unfortunately, a very strong racist backlash. People being yelled at in the streets, bottled, I remember those days. And there was lots of anti-Asian media all through the early 1990s, and that Tom Scott cartoon on the top right is a commentary on that. But that migration change has really brought massive changes for all of us. And there's so much more energy and diversity in our communities, which you can totally see from these photos. I think the big takeout from what we've seen from this image is that we are all different. As Chinese New Zealanders, we're all different. We have different histories, but we all live in Aotearoa, and this is the commonality that brings us all together.
Tēnā koutou katoa te whānau. Tēnā koe, Kirsten, me tēnā o ngā kōrero. Whānau, I think the richness of the discussion is going to come with some Q&A. In that, I'm sure our panel are going to divulge some of the origin stories. And, Mongshu, you mentioned earlier about Moana Jackson. I'm sure some of those stories are going to come out in some of the answers. But I thought at this juncture we might just get straight into some questions, Whānau, and I'm going to start some of the Q&A right now, if that's okay. Okay, I have got one from Kyle Tan. Kia ora panels, thanks for the interesting discussion. Te Tiriti has been mentioned a few times in today's webinar. As Chinese leaders in your own communities, do you think there are sufficient awareness of Te Tiriti and our position as tangata Tiriti amongst Chinese in Aotearoa? There also seems to be increasing division among Chinese of different nationalities and political stances. How do you think Te Tiriti can help the Chinese communities to bridge these differences? And I open the floor.
I can try and answer that. I don't think there is enough. I don't think it's sufficient understanding of Te Tiriti. Even having grown up here, the kind of schooling that I had really doesn't give you much detail as to what Te Tiriti really meant. It gives you this kind of idea, oh, there's like these two different versions, but actually the only legitimate version is the Te Reo Māori version. It's not a version, it's the like Te Tiriti. And that Māori never ceded sovereignty, and there's these kind of misconceptions that still kind of float around because of a lot of Pākehā myths about the treaty that's been going on for a long time. And I think one of the ways that we can make it more accessible for our communities to learn some of these histories is for us to take on that responsibility of doing that, educating ourselves, and also to make it more accessible linguistically for communities who may not speak fluent English.
Does anyone from the panel want to add on to that kōrero?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point that was asked about how can Te Tiriti bridge divides between our different communities, and I literally have never thought of it like that. Because like the ways that we engage our different communities with Te Tiriti work is so different. Like for example, I'm not a leader of my community. But my community pretty much just kind of has the same, I would say the same attitudes to Te Tiriti as like Pākehā New Zealand, because my community is so well integrated into Pākehā society. We just absorbed all of those lessons. So where I see people from my community engaged with treaty work, it's usually either with Pākehā as a mediating kind of force, like they're in a Pākehā rōpū, like in a group, or they're an Asian supporting Tino Rangatiratanga. So I think, all roads lead to Mongzu as usual, with the incredible work that you do, because I think that having an organization like that and having like a focus, which is actually quite a diverse organization of radicals, yes, but you have to start with the group that takes everyone in. Because when I was starting out with this kind of thinking back in like 15 to 20 years ago, I stood in like the hikoi for the Foreshore seabed, and I looked out trying to find Asians. And I spotted like 3 Asians, and we're all so happy to see each other. And we're all from different places, different backgrounds. And I thought to myself, wow, imagine if we'd like known each other beforehand and could have met up and like gone together. So I think that like a lot of it comes down to organizing structures, and with the kind of work that Mongzu does, having set up this organizing structure, it's like an incredible focal point, and it only is growing in its membership and in its reach. And I think that's one of the most important things to do, is to work at that grassroots level of grassroots activists, people who are attracted to activism and who have the energy to go back to their communities and sort of spread that word.
I think related to that, building on what's been just said, is an understanding of ourselves as diverse Chinese communities and the references between biocultural governance, Te Tiriti based, and where does the multicultural aspect sit within that plane of reference. And I think there's, I hear all different kinds of takes on that, because there hasn't been the conversations. I don't need to start looking at first the history, and I think the curriculum and understanding what's led to this point, but also connecting up with the Te Tiriti and having like the conversations we're having now is an important part of that. Yeah.
Kia ora te whānau. I think this also is a nice segue into Madeline Fang's question. There is clearly a lot of grassroots community-based action to foster a sense of belonging for Chinese, Asians and Aotearoa as tangata tiriti. Do you feel that there is much action awareness by government to foster a more inclusive Te Tiriti-based sense of belonging for everyone? Or is it a case of how can we rebuild the master's house with the master's tools?
I think I'm the only one here that hasn't worked for government. So I don't know what goes on to, like, you know, everyday processes of it, but government policies and initiatives are not something that I would want to wait for or necessarily have much faith in. I think a lot of this work we need to do on the grassroots level, and the government is also a crown structure, and Parliament itself is a violation of Te Tiriti because it's not supposed to have any kind of power or sovereignty over tangata whenua, right? So I guess for those of us who want to see kind of constitutional transformation and Te Tiriti actually honoured, I think the vehicle is more through community than through government.
I think there's a role for government, but I think that in relation to Te Tiriti, it's about the latter. It's about, and I think government is grappling with that currently. It's about the reframing. It's about what is a partnership and what is a relationship. Some of the initiatives I've seen, like there's the Welcoming Communities currently. So basically I started in the public sector in 87, 88, which is when what Kirsten was talking about, the point system came in. Prior to that, new migrants that came to Aotearoa were from like cultures, so they were the like nations. And then with the opening up based on, you know, you get a certain number of points for, you know, skill, age, educate, those kinds of things. So it just became a much, you know, it took the colour aspect away from it, if you like. And after that, there were settlement programs brought in. And so we've had this real fluctuation of really a strong settlement focus, simply because I think that's where you had the qualifications and the tax, all that kind of frame of reference that happened because there was, I think, a lack of initiatives in place for establishing, those communities of different cultures when they came to Aotearoa. Same with the refugee sort of quota settlement. We opened and broadened that too in terms of like nations and others. And so there have been attempts, and there are currently initiatives around that settlement space. There's currently the social cohesion consultations going on. But in my mind, there has been more of a one-way dialogue of the central government offering out rather than more of a collaborative dialogue. And I think it's going to take some, you know, we're in the space of innovation and transformation. And I think that kind of is what needs to happen as well in terms of getting, shifting the space and shifting the conversation more towards that equal Te Tiriti power sharing kind of base, even at the local community levels, hopefully.
When I think about progress, so I think of the people who've gone before us, and I also think of our elders now. You know, I was talking to Auntie Esther Fung when we were up in Hokianga and Opanone last year, and she grabbed me by the hand and she said to me, "We must make relationships." Oh, I shouldn't do that voice. We must make relationships with tangata whenua. You know, they are our natural allies. And you know, when things go well for them, things go better for us. And I think that's really the bottom line. And you know, so I think yes, you know, we should do all that civic participation stuff. But I also think that that our progress is going to be propelled by actual genuine relationships that aren't mediated by Pākehā. So things like you know, real, you know, community to community relationships, wagun to marae relationships, people to people, family to family, all those things in so many different ways are going to make progress, drive it forward in a really diverse and complex and knitted together way. Yeah, that's what I think, and I think that's what the vision has been for a while. So
Yeah,
to be able to pass that on.
in terms of like, I've been a civil servant on and off, but I'm not really married to the state, kind of in and out. You know, it's like an open relationship. And I got to say, like, the thing with the state is that it doesn't just give up power, right? You got to take it. The power has to either be taken or like persuade them to see that it's in everyone's best interest, so they share it, or you got to trick them out of it somehow. Like I'm not like super optimistic that like the state's just going to be like, here, have the power, you know, here is your sovereignty. And it's the grassroots and it's the community that is going to build the forces to take the power back, you know. Like I work a lot in kind of very kind of over time with sort of progressive sounding social wings of government, and you know, they go through the words and there's all the frameworks, and at the end of the day, are you giving the power back? Are you giving the land back? Are you giving the budget? It just comes down to that. And you know, a lot of the time they can't do that. They're not going to do that until you just get to like this complete opportunity point where, you know, you can get whānau ora. Or because there was a massive social movement, there was a new political party created. They struck the devil's bargain. You know, I'm talking about the Māori Party, struck a devil's bargain with the National Party, and they got this one policy, whānau ora, which is this, you know, a great kaupapa Māori approach to holistic public health, right? These things, these opportunities happen in a very weird strategic way. You can't always predict how they're going to happen. You can't just say, we must work within the state. We must work outside the state, because you've got all the movers, all the activists, they actually move in and out of the public sector and the state system all the time. And that's why it does come down to communities, because the communities are moving in and out of the state structure, trying to influence it, trying to steal from it. We're like the tricksters, trying to like trick the state out of its power. Yeah, that's kind of how I see things.
I think that's such an important analysis of power, because, like, you know, where can we build power and where power currently exists, and if we kind of shift that power away from state structures and into community, then we can really be that force for change. And I think part of that is what you said, Kirsten, was building direct relationships with tangata whenua. I think for too long those relationships have been mediated by Pākehā, and mediated in ways that have been really divisive. You know, if you think about the history of anti-Chinese racism in Aotearoa, a lot of that was specifically mobilized and fed to Māori communities so that Chinese would be seen as a threat rather than Pākehā. And a lot of that controversy around Māori-Chinese intermarriage was about like the white fear of Māori and Chinese communities becoming allies and becoming families and building that kind of connection and solidarity. And I think just going off what you said before, Kirsten, about honoring those genealogies, I guess, is that those solidarities have been there for a long time, and a lot of those stories are not very well known. And I was like super appreciative of Dr. Moana Jackson for sharing some of those stories with us in 2018 when he was talking about the relevance of Te Tiriti to Asians, and some of those earlier stories of parihaka men in Otago or Dunedin who had defended Chinese miners against white supremacist attacks, and some of the Chinese market gardeners in Waikato were feeding some of the Te Puhi-led conscientious objectors from Waikato. Those are the kind of stories I think are really powerful in thinking about our relationships and where we want those to go. And I just want to like share a quote from that hui that he said, where he said that Te Tiriti o Waitangi for me welcome people from somewhere else onto our marae. You are welcome. You can live your lives as who you are, but this is the basic kawa, that you'll respect the rights of others and you'll respect the land and you'll work together to make this a better place. And I hope that's something we can carry with us into the future.
Kia ora koutou. I'm going to segue into another question from Salvi Balusu Brahmaniam. And she asks, how can we balance the survival mindset of recent migrants with solidarity with tangata whenua? Or is it first generation Asian New Zealanders to be able to look up or step up and be activists? Or can we all take part in different ways? So I suppose that's a question. So our panel, you all very much grounded in the Aotearoa context. And so recent migrants coming into Aotearoa can see the social injustice, the inequities, the dishonouring of the Te Tiriti context. And recent immigrants, whānau, want to do something. What can they do?
I mean, they can get involved in ASTA. But I do think there is something to be said about kind of first generation migrants, like my parents' generation, who were just very focused on surviving and didn't really have energy for other things. But in my generation, where we've been privileged to kind of grow up in the education system, to be able to speak English without, you know, a foreign accent or whatever, like we are in a well-positioned place to do that kind of work, and I kind of wouldn't necessarily expect my parents' generation to do that, but I do think there is always a place for people to be involved in some way or another.
Yeah, what we call the 1.5 generation, which is you, Mangzu, and that's definitely the wave of new young activists that I see on the scene, who have so much, you know, fresh energy, but they're really rooted in their parents' migration struggles as well. Yeah, but you know, I think the as the original question was phrased, you know, everyone has a role to play. In some ways, when we've talked about like what ASTA does and how a lot of it is even just starting with your parents, right? Just having conversations with your parents. I never had to have that conversation with my parents. But like a lot of people will it's probably the hardest thing. Like you can go and do a workshop with like some people who voluntarily come to the library and teach them about Te Tiriti, but then it's like, well, what if I have to have the same conversation with my parents? I've never had to have that obstacle. Like I've never had the aunties breathing over my neck. But I'd be really interested to see, you know, I know that the NZCA was itself, it took a long time for it to kind of absorb these ideas. And it's like the most well-established old Chinese organization in the country. Maybe Kirsten can shed some light on that.
Yeah, it is, you know, it's challenging because you have a lot, you know, especially, and especially I want to bring together that idea of diversity again. You know, everybody is really diverse. You know, when we say, you know, the Chinese community, actually we're talking about, you know, a whole lot of different views, a whole lot of different migration experiences. So what tends to happen with these larger community groups is, you know, they tend to follow mainstream sort of ideas. So when ideas sort of flower and, you know, when things started to get more mainstream, it tends to, you know, follow along. But I think not quite sure what I'm saying, I've forgotten, but I think the idea of actually maybe has anyone got anything else to say, because I've totally forgotten that train of thought.
I think part of it is about, and I think it's some of the exciting stuff we see with the work that New Zealand Seaman and Kirsten are doing, is the opportunity of somewhere to show up, somewhere to have a voice, where you're not on your own as a new migrant. And so seeing some of those activities that connects to what I think you're saying, Kirsten, which is around, there is we can't be in isolation when we're trying to do these things, and it has to be in relationship, and it has to be in relationship across to tangata whenua and others as well. in how we operate. But as Tim was saying, we've all got a role, but it is all about context. It's all about, you know, where we each are at in our place. And it may be just about reaching out to find out more, or sharing in whatever language, in Mandarin or Cantonese. You know, I think there's a whole range of ways in terms of that.
Yeah,
I might actually chuck it back to you, Kirsten, and give you an opportunity to answer this question. This is from Paul Teal, which is I observed that Asian as a group was not mentioned in the government policy and consultation and agenda, but referred as immigrants, whereas Māori, Pacifica, women, etc. are referred as groups. I wondered what is the reason behind this?
Well, you have to ask them, but my theory is forever foreigners. You see, you know, the concept of, well, you know, we go back to our history again, and, you know, all that anti-Chinese immigration legislation stuff happened in the late 19th century, which just so happened to be the very time when New Zealand's national identity, national Pākehā identity was being formed. So, you know, in some ways, that's this concept of making New Zealand as a better Britain of the South Seas necessarily involved othering groups like Indians, Chinese, Syrians, you know, all the people who weren't white. So that there's a real hangover now to think that when people are not white, then they're not New Zealanders, but especially Asians. Yeah, we call it the whole forever foreigner thing. That is another complexity.
Kia ora te whānau. Thank you very much, Kirsten, for that answer. Unfortunately, it is time to wrap things up. However, on behalf of DCOL 2022, on behalf of all the attendees of today's kaupapa, and of course on behalf of all of our partners, I'd like to thank our panel for sharing of their experiences, sharing of their stories, sharing of, you know, what do we do from here on in. And I think all of the whānau have actually got a lot of pearls of wisdom to move forward with some of the ideas that you've shared. Nō reira kia koutou, Kirsten, Bev, Xiu Ming, Mong Shu. I'd like to thank you for being a part of our kaupapa this afternoon. Nō reira e te whānau, do a virtual homai te paki. And just in closing, whānau, the recording will be made available via YouTube and the website, depending on IP agreement terms with each speaker. So I did note that someone wanted to have a copy of some of the your slideshow, Kirsten. So hopefully that'll be made available on the YouTube video to rewatch. Also, whānau, to promote the Facebook group, DCOL. It says 2020, but I'm sure it's 2022. And just remind people, there are more sessions coming up, whānau. So just have a look at your schedule, and we hope to see you again very soon. There's also this slide here, whānau, Kei Te Muru o Te Ahi, in partnership with Pecha Kucha, the final day of Treaty-Based Futures Anti-Racism 2022 will be a platform for emerging voices. So check that out as well, whānau. Hoi anō, it is 1:01, so without any further ado, e mihi ana ki a koutou katoa. E ngā pūkenga, e ngā tuhi māreikura ki a koutou katoa. Ko ai au, ko Valence Smith tōku ingoa, hoi anō, ko taku krani pāpā, e no haina katoa ia ko Wang Kia Fui tōna ingoa no te rohe o Sunway. Nō reira, taku whānau e mihi nei ki a koutou katoa, o tira ki a tātou katoa, e hui mai nei I tēnei ata, I tēnei ahi, tēnā koutou kia ino I tātou. Kia tau iho anō te tauwhirotanga te wāhi ngaro e pai ai te noho tahi a tina wairua hoki. Werohia te manua ki ngā mātāpono, te tika me te pono, me te aroha kia whakamaua kia China. Hau me hui e, taiki e. Hei kona whānau.